At 27,000 feet above the English countryside on the morning of April 27, 1944, Squadron Leader Anthony Martindale felt his Spitfire accelerate beyond anything he'd ever experienced. The needle on his airspeed indicator swept past 600 miles per hour. The aircraft shuddered. Through his headset, he heard a sound like a rifle shot, then a grinding metallic scream that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before everything went silent except for the howl of wind. Oil sprayed across his windscreen, turning the world dark. Martindale couldn't see forward. He couldn't see the ground rushing up. What he could see, through the side panels, was the propeller spinning away from his aircraft, tumbling end over end toward the fields below. 3 massive blades, the reduction gearing, the entire assembly that connected engine to thrust, gone. Just gone. The Spitfire's nose snapped upward. The G-forces slammed Martindale back into his seat with violence that crushed his vision to tunnel darkness. His aircraft, suddenly tail-heavy without the propeller's weight, was climbing at an impossible angle. The last thing Martindale saw was the altimeter unwinding. Then consciousness left him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When Martindale woke, his Spitfire was at 40,000 feet, gliding in silence. The engine was dead. The propeller was somewhere in Kent. He was alone in the sky with a crippled aircraft and no power. Below him, 20 miles away, was RAF Farnborough. Between here and there was enemy-occupied Europe to the south, the English Channel, and the certainty that he had perhaps 10 minutes of glide time before this test aircraft became a very expensive lawn ornament. What happened in those 10 minutes would prove something the Royal Air Force had suspected but never fully tested. A pilot who truly understood his aircraft, who kept his nerve when machinery failed, could make a fighter do things that seemed impossible. Martindale's glide would become legendary not because it was the longest or the most dramatic, but because it demonstrated the difference between a pilot and someone who merely flew planes. But understanding why Martindale succeeded requires understanding what the Spitfire was, how test pilots operated in 1944, and why the British were pushing these aircraft to speeds where the laws of aerodynamics started to bend. The Supermarine Spitfire began as Reginald Mitchell's answer to a Royal Air Force requirement for a modern interceptor fighter. Mitchell, chief designer at Supermarine Aviation Works, was dying of cancer when he finalized the design in 1936. He would not live to see the Battle of Britain, where his creation would help save his country. The Spitfire that entered service in 1938 was powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing 1,030 horsepower. The airframe featured an elliptical wing designed by Beverly Shenstone. This wing shape wasn't chosen for aesthetics. It provided the thinnest possible cross-section while maintaining structural strength. Sunken rivets reduced drag. Every detail served speed. Early production Spitfires could reach 360 miles per hour in level flight. They carried 8.303 caliber Browning machine guns. The cockpit was cramped. Visibility over the nose was poor during landing. The narrow landing gear made ground handling difficult. But in the air, properly flown, the Spitfire could turn inside anything the Luftwaffe had in 1940. By 1944, the Spitfire had evolved through dozens of variants. The Mark 11, which Martindale flew, was a photo reconnaissance version. No guns. No armor except behind the pilot's head. The weight savings increased speed and altitude capability. These aircraft were painted light blue and operated alone, deep over enemy territory, relying on speed and altitude to survive. The Marquis Merlin engine produced 1,470 horsepower at altitude. Top speed exceeded 420 miles per hour in level flight. Service ceiling was over 43,000 feet. Range with drop tanks exceeded 1,500 miles. These were the fastest operational Spitfires in service. But speed created problems that British engineers didn't fully understand. At high velocities, air behaves differently. Above about 500 miles per hour, local airflow over certain parts of the aircraft could exceed the speed of sound even when the aircraft itself was flying slower than sound. These localized supersonic pockets created shock waves. The shock waves disrupted airflow. Control surfaces became less effective. Forces built up that Mitchell's original design never anticipated. This phenomenon was called compressibility. Allied pilots had encountered it in combat dives. The aircraft would begin to shake. Controls would stiffen or become unresponsive. In extreme cases, the aircraft would enter an uncontrollable dive. Some pilots recovered. Others didn't. In 1943, the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough initiated a test program to study compressibility systematically. They needed data. They needed to know exactly what happened to aircraft structure and control when approaching the speed of sound. This information would guide the design of future fighters. The RAE selected the Spitfire Mark 11 for these tests because it could reach higher speeds in a dive than almost any other operational aircraft. The test aircraft, serial number EN409, was modified with special instrumentation. Cameras recorded instrument readings. Accelerometers measured G-forces. External sensors tracked air pressure at multiple points on the wing and fuselage. A fully feathering rotor propeller was installed. This propeller could rotate its blades to minimum drag position when the engine wasn't providing power. The feathering mechanism was critical. Without it, a windmilling propeller at extreme speeds would create drag and potentially overspeed until the blades shattered. The test profile was straightforward in theory. Climb to 40,000 feet or higher. Accelerate to maximum level flight speed. Push into a 45-degree dive. Hold the dive through the compressibility region. Collect data. Pull out. Land. Analyze. Squadron Leader J.R. Tobin had flown EN409 on February 27, 1944. He reached 606 miles per hour at 29,000 feet during the dive. That was Mach 0.89, 89% of the speed of sound at that altitude. The aircraft buffeted violently. Wing rivets popped. But Tobin recovered and landed safely. The data was valuable. Engineers wanted more. 2 months later, on April 27th, it was Martindale's turn. Anthony Featherstone Haw Martindale was born October 25, 1910. He joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve before the war. When hostilities began, his engineering background and steady temperament marked him as ideal for test flying. Test pilots in the Second World War occupied a strange position between military and civilian roles. They flew military aircraft on military bases under military authority. But their mission wasn't combat. Their job was to find the limits of aircraft performance, document those limits, and survive the experience so the data could be used to improve designs or tactics. This work killed many of them. Engine failures at low altitude, structural failures at high speed, control system malfunctions, unknown aerodynamic phenomena. Every test flight entered territory where the aircraft hadn't been before. Every test flight risked discovering a fatal flaw the hard way. Martindale understood these risks. By April 1944, he'd flown dozens of test missions in Spitfires, Hurricanes, captured German aircraft, and experimental prototypes. He knew how aircraft behaved at the edge of their performance envelope. He knew the subtle cues that indicated approaching trouble. Vibration frequency, control feel, engine sounds, temperature readings. A test pilot learned to integrate hundreds of sensory inputs and recognize patterns that meant danger. On the morning of April 27th, the weather was clear. Visibility excellent. Perfect conditions for a high-speed test. Martindale climbed into EN409 at Farnborough. The pre-flight checks were routine. Engine temperatures normal. Oil pressure good. All instruments functioning. The aircraft had been thoroughly inspected after Tobin's flight. The popped rivets had been replaced. Everything mechanical was correct. Martindale took off at approximately 10:30 in the morning. He climbed steadily, circling to gain altitude. The Merlin engine ran smoothly. At 40,000 feet, he leveled off and performed the standard checks. He set the propeller to full fine pitch for maximum power. He opened the throttle completely. The Spitfire accelerated. At 170 miles per hour indicated airspeed, he pushed the control column forward. The nose dropped. The dive began. The aircraft accelerated rapidly. 200 miles per hour. 300. 400. The buffeting started around 500 miles per hour. The control column vibrated in his hands. He could feel the airframe stress through the structure. 550 miles per hour. The wings flexed visibly. 600 miles per hour. The buffeting intensified. 620 miles per hour indicated. The actual speed was higher because instrument readings lagged behind true airspeed. Martindale was approaching Mach 0.92. At 27,000 feet, traveling at approximately 620 miles per hour, the propeller's reduction gearing failed catastrophically. This component connected the propeller shaft to the engine crankshaft through a gear train that reduced rotational speed. The Merlin engine could turn at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The propeller needed to turn much slower, around 1,200 RPM, to remain efficient. The reduction gear provided this speed conversion. When the gearing failed, the propeller was suddenly free to spin as fast as aerodynamic forces would drive it. At 620 miles per hour, those forces were enormous. The propeller accelerated instantly. The blades, designed for 1,200 RPM, were now experiencing centrifugal forces far beyond their design limits. Metal stressed past its breaking point. The entire propeller assembly, blades and hub, tore away from the nose of the aircraft. The separation was violent. Pieces of reduction gearing remained attached to the engine. Oil lines ruptured. Hydraulic fluid sprayed from severed connections. Hot oil from the engine compartment was sucked backward by the slipstream and plastered across Martindale's windscreen. He couldn't see forward, but he could feel what was happening. Without the propeller's mass at the nose, the Spitfire's center of gravity shifted instantly aft. The aircraft was now tail-heavy. An airplane's center of gravity determines how it balances in flight. Move the center of gravity aft, and the nose wants to come up. In normal flight, this would be manageable with control inputs. But Martindale was diving at over 600 miles per hour when the shift occurred. The Spitfire's nose snapped upward. The aircraft pulled out of the dive violently, entering a zoom climb at an extreme angle. The G-forces were immediate and crushing. Martindale's vision narrowed as blood drained from his brain toward his feet. The G-load exceeded anything he'd experienced. Probably 11 G or more. His body weighed more than 1,000 pounds under that acceleration. His arms became too heavy to move. His vision tunneled to a pinpoint, then went black. The Spitfire continued climbing. Without pilot input, without power, the aircraft followed the ballistic arc determined by its velocity and the angle at which the nose had pitched up. Climbed through 30,000 feet. Through 35,000 feet. The airspeed bled off as altitude increased. By 40,000 feet, the climb slowed. The aircraft leveled off, then began to descend slowly as speed decayed below the minimum needed to sustain altitude. Martindale regained consciousness somewhere around 40,000 feet. How long he'd been unconscious, he didn't know. Probably between 30 and 60 seconds. His vision cleared gradually. His first awareness was of silence. The engine was dead. No propeller noise. No vibration. Just wind noise and the faint creaks of airframe structure. He looked at his instruments. Altitude 40,000 feet, descending slowly. Airspeed 120 miles per hour, decreasing. Oil pressure 0. All engine instruments reading 0. The propeller RPM gauge showed nothing because there was no propeller. Through the side panels of the cockpit, he could see his wings. They looked wrong. The leading edges, which had been perfectly straight before the dive, now had a swept-back appearance. The wings had been bent by aerodynamic forces during the high-speed dive and the violent pull-up. The Spitfire's wings were not designed to sweep back. This was permanent structural deformation. Martindale's first thought was to bail out. Standard procedure for engine failure over England was to bail out and let the aircraft crash somewhere uninhabited. But he hesitated. He was at 40,000 feet with considerable altitude to work with. The glide ratio of a Spitfire without power was better than most pilots realized. Maybe 15 to 1. For every mile of altitude, he could glide 15 miles horizontally. He had 7.5 miles of altitude. That meant potentially over 100 miles of glide range, assuming he managed it perfectly. But perfect glide management required visibility. His forward windscreen was covered with oil. He could only see to the sides. That complicated navigation and landing considerably. Farnborough was to the northeast, approximately 20 miles away. If he could maintain an efficient glide, he might reach the airfield. The alternative was finding an emergency field, belly landing in a farmer's field, or bailing out. All those options meant losing the aircraft and the data recorded by the onboard instruments. Martindale made his decision. He would attempt to glide to Farnborough. He transmitted on the radio. "Farnborough, this is Martindale. N409. Lost propeller in dive. Engine out. Attempting glide return. 40,000 feet, 20 miles southwest." The response was immediate. "Understood. Field is clear. Emergency services standing by. What assistance do you need?" "None. Will attempt straight-in approach. Cannot see forward. Windscreen covered with oil." "Copy. We're tracking you. Current winds light. From the west." Martindale established best glide speed. For a Spitfire without power, this was approximately 120 miles per hour indicated. Too slow, and he'd lose altitude rapidly. Too fast, and he'd waste energy overcoming drag. He trimmed the aircraft carefully for hands-off glide at that speed. Without the propeller, the Spitfire glided remarkably smoothly. The usual asymmetric thrust effects were gone. The P-factor that required constant rudder pressure in powered flight disappeared. The aircraft felt balanced, almost peaceful in its descent. He could navigate using landmarks visible through the side panels. The English countryside below was familiar. He'd flown over it hundreds of times. Fields, roads, villages, rivers. The Thames was visible to the east, a silver line in the morning sun. The North Downs rose green to the south. Farnborough was northeast of his current position, beyond the urban sprawl spreading west from London. He calculated angles constantly. Altitude divided by distance. Glide ratio. Wind drift. He was descending at approximately 700 feet per minute. Every minute gave him about 2.5 miles of forward travel at his current speed. 20 miles would take 8 minutes. But he was losing speed. At lower altitudes, the glide ratio would degrade slightly. He'd need to manage his altitude carefully. At 30,000 feet, he could see Farnborough in the distance. The airfield was clearly visible, a rectangular patch of grass runways northeast of the town. He was still high. He had excess altitude. This was good. Excess altitude could be converted to distance, or burned off in turns or sideslips if needed. Running out of altitude short of the field would be catastrophic. He flew slightly to the left of the direct course to Farnborough. This gave him options. If he maintained altitude better than expected, he could turn right and approach the field from the south. If altitude decayed faster, he could cut the corner and make a straight-in approach. At 20,000 feet, he passed over Guildford. The town's medieval center was clearly visible below. He was 10 miles from Farnborough. Still high. His glide was efficient. The bent wings apparently weren't creating as much drag as he'd feared. At 15,000 feet, he began his descent pattern. Farnborough had 2 primary runways, north-south and east-west. The wind was light from the west. That favored the east-west runway. But without forward visibility, he needed the longest possible runway regardless of wind direction. The north-south runway was longer. He entered a wide left turn, positioning to approach from the south. The turn was gentle, using minimal bank angle to avoid excessive altitude loss. He could see the airfield clearly through the left side of his canopy. Fire trucks and ambulances were positioned near the runway intersection. Personnel were standing clear. At 10,000 feet, he rolled wings level on the southbound approach course. 5 miles to the threshold. Still high. He needed to lose altitude without excessive speed. He extended the landing gear. The hydraulic system was dead, so the gear fell under its own weight and locked into place. The additional drag from the extended wheels increased his sink rate. Perfect. At 5,000 feet, 3 miles from the threshold, he realized he was going to make it. The runway was clearly visible through the side panels. His sink rate and forward speed were manageable. The main challenge would be the landing flare without forward visibility. At 2,000 feet, 1 mile from the threshold, Martindale adjusted his glide path slightly. He could see the runway environment through peripheral vision, the approach lights, the boundary markers, the grass edges. He'd landed at Farnborough hundreds of times. Muscle memory would compensate for the lack of forward vision. 1,000 feet. Half a mile. The sink rate was 700 feet per minute. Airspeed 110 miles per hour. He was coming in slightly fast, but that gave him energy for the flare. The runway threshold passed beneath his wings. 500 feet. He could see the runway surface through the side panels. Gray concrete rushing past. 300 feet. He began the flare, pulling back gently on the control column. The nose came up. The sink rate decreased. 200 feet. 100 feet. The Spitfire settled, falling the last few feet more quickly than he'd have liked. The main wheels touched first. The tail wheel came down hard. The aircraft bounced slightly, then settled. Martindale held the control column back, keeping weight off the nose. Without a propeller, the engine mounting was exposed. If the nose dipped, metal would scrape concrete. He held the tail down as speed decayed. 60 miles per hour. 50. 40. The tail wheel stayed planted. At 30 miles per hour, he let the nose settle gently. Metal scraped, but nothing catastrophic. The Spitfire rolled to a stop in the middle of the runway. Fire trucks approached immediately, foam cannons ready. But there was no fire, just oil dripping from the cowling and a pilot who just glided 20 miles with no engine. Martindale shut down the remaining systems, unfastened his harness, and opened the canopy. The morning air was cool and smelled of grass and aviation fuel. Ground crew reached the aircraft within seconds. Someone put a ladder against the fuselage. Martindale climbed out slowly. His back hurt. The G-forces during the zoom climb had compressed his spine. He wouldn't know for years that he'd suffered vertebral damage that day. The station commander approached, along with the chief engineer. They looked at the aircraft in silence. The missing propeller, the bent wings, the oil-covered windscreen. One of the engineers walked around to the nose and examined the exposed reduction gear housing. Pieces of shattered metal protruded at odd angles. "You flew it back," the commander said. "It wasn't a question." "The glide characteristics were acceptable," Martindale replied. "I saw no reason to abandon a recoverable aircraft. And the camera? Should have recorded everything through the failure point. The data's intact." The engineers swarmed the aircraft. The camera housing was opened carefully. The film was removed and rushed to the laboratory for development. The data would show exactly what had happened during the propeller failure. More importantly, it would show the aircraft's behavior at Mach 0.92, the fastest speed ever recorded for a piston-engine fighter in controlled flight. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Martindale's decision to save the aircraft rather than bail out proved critical for several reasons. The photographic data from the dive provided insights into high-speed aerodynamics that influenced post-war fighter design. The evidence of wing deformation demonstrated that aircraft structure could survive transonic speeds if properly designed. The fact that the Spitfire remained controllable after such catastrophic mechanical failure validated the fundamental soundness of Mitchell's original design. Martindale was awarded the Air Force Cross for the flight. The citation noted his exceptional skill and determination in bringing his damaged aircraft safely to base, thereby preserving valuable test data and equipment. It didn't mention that he'd just completed one of the most remarkable glides in aviation history. But Martindale wasn't finished with high-speed testing. 5 months later, on September 15, 1944, he was flying another high-speed dive in a different Spitfire Mark 11, serial number PL827. At 24,000 feet, the supercharger burst. The engine caught fire. Martindale tried to extinguish it by diving, which worked briefly, but his windscreen was again covered, this time with oil and soot. He attempted another forced landing at Farnborough. On final approach, he spotted high-tension power cables across his path at the last second. He pulled up to clear them, which killed his remaining airspeed. The Spitfire crashed into Whitmore Common near Worplesdon, hitting a copse of trees. The aircraft caught fire on impact. Martindale, suffering from an undiagnosed back injury from the first incident, extracted himself from the burning wreck. He retrieved the speed recording camera from the aircraft before flames engulfed it. He kept bystanders clear until the National Fire Service arrived. For this action, he was awarded a bar to his Air Force Cross, essentially receiving the decoration twice for 2 separate acts of extraordinary airmanship. The compressibility research program at Farnborough contributed directly to British understanding of transonic flight. The data informed design of swept-wing aircraft. The knowledge of shock wave behavior influenced control surface design. The lessons about structural limits shaped metal fatigue research. None of this would have been possible without pilots like Martindale who flew to the edge of what was survivable and brought back the data. After the war, Martindale became Chief Development Engineer for the motor car division of Rolls-Royce. The same company whose Merlin engine had powered the Spitfires he'd tested now employed him to develop automotive engines. He worked on gas turbine applications for vehicles, applying lessons learned from aviation to ground transportation. Martindale died on July 14, 1959, at age 48. The back injury from the 1944 Zoom climb had never properly healed. Compressed vertebrae, undiagnosed stress fractures, cumulative damage from years of high-G testing. His body paid the price for his service. In 409, the Spitfire he'd glided to safety, was repaired and returned to testing. The bent wings were documented, photographed, and eventually straightened. The aircraft flew again with a new propeller and modified reduction gearing. It survived the war and was eventually scrapped in the late 1940s when the test program concluded. The story of Martindale's glide deserves remembering not because it was the longest powerless flight or the most dramatic emergency landing. Other pilots glided farther. Other emergencies were more visually spectacular. What makes Martindale's achievement significant is what it represented about the relationship between pilot and machine. A less experienced pilot might have panicked when the propeller tore away at 600 miles per hour. A less skilled pilot might have fought the controls during the Zoom climb, making the situation worse. A less knowledgeable pilot might not have recognized that the aircraft, despite catastrophic damage, remained fundamentally airworthy. Martindale succeeded because he understood aircraft systems deeply enough to recognize what had failed and what remained functional. He understood aerodynamics well enough to establish optimal glide speed immediately. He understood navigation well enough to calculate angles and distances without instruments. He understood his own capabilities well enough to recognize that attempting the landing was risky but achievable. Test pilots in the Second World War operated at the boundary between what was known and what was possible. Every flight pushed that boundary slightly farther. Some pilots died pushing it. Others, like Martindale, survived to push it again the next day. Their work, often unheralded, made possible the jet age that followed. The Spitfire itself stands as testament to what superb engineering and courageous testing can achieve. Mitchell designed an airframe so fundamentally sound that it could survive conditions he never imagined. The aircraft that entered service in 1938 was still competitive in 1945, through continuous development and refinement. Martindale's glides proved the design could handle not just normal operations, but catastrophic failures while still bringing the pilot home. The lessons remain relevant. Understanding your equipment, maintaining composure under pressure, making calculated decisions when survival depends on judgment rather than procedure. These principles transcend aviation. They apply anywhere human beings operate complex systems at the limits of performance. Martindale's 20-mile glide took approximately 10 minutes from loss of the propeller to wheels touching concrete. 10 minutes that encapsulated years of training, months of preparation, and seconds of terror transformed into action. 10 minutes that proved one quiet test pilot could do something nobody thought possible. 10 minutes that saved an aircraft, preserved data, and added one more story to the legend of the Spitfire. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.